What the hell's going on down there today? Like they said this morning, nobody's sitting, and then now people are sitting. Like, was that a miscommunication? Was that a change in game plan? How do you break down what happened this morning?
As best as I can tell, it's a change in game plan. I don't believe there's any chicanery this morning in terms of the lineup that was shown at the morning skate and what Craig Berube told the reporters in New Jersey when he spoke early afternoon. I think was the truth at that point. It sounds like the players that are being scratched tonight, all found out somewhere after that stage that they were out of the lineup, and it doesn't seem as though anything is necessarily imminent in terms of moves for any of those guys. It's purely protecting the assets. Obviously, those are players that are in play for the Leafs for trades, but it's not as though I have any indication at this point that there's a deal coming for any of them in the next hour or so. So, does seem as though the Leafs are kind of adjusting on the fly, I guess, to their circumstances. I know they haven't been happy with some of the offers they've got so far, which probably is evident by the fact they haven't made a trade just yet. But keeping these three guys out of the lineup, if they're able to move all of them by the deadline, and it will be the kind of deadline I think a lot of fans and those of us on the outside have been expecting from them.
Yeah, and to confirm, that's Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Bobby McMann, Scott Laughton not playing tonight. Beyond those three, because now they're clearly out there, I don't see how you don't trade them if you're Brad Treliving. Obviously, it is possible it can happen, but I think you basically put up the white flag on those three guys that you're looking to move them, and you feel pretty comfortable there's going to be a market for them that you'll accept. Where does your head go next with the Leafs? Who's the fourth guy on your list that you think is out there and likely to be traded?
I think the next in line after those three players is Nicholas Waugh, just because you see what McCarron got in that deal last night that Nashville and Minnesota made. He's a big right shot defenseman, bottom six guy. Has a little more offensive upside, I'd say, than McCarron. Obviously, a little smaller than him, but he's a big centerman, and so I could see very much him being moved. And then you have some of the, we'll call them depth pieces on the Leafs. Guys like Calle Yarncroke and we'll see about Troy Stetcher, but they're both UFAs. There is a world if they end up moving three or four what I'll call bigger pieces. That they are also able to shed a couple other players, and it ends up being a little bit more than maybe what I would have thought a week ago. But we'll just have to see how things develop. But clearly, look, if you're Toronto, I think we all understand where they're at with these guys. I realize there's going to be a big challenge to clearly be better next year, especially if you trade someone like OEL who's got term left on his deal. But this season has been so far off the mark that they have to try to chart a path forward, and it does seem as though they're getting down the road at least a little bit towards selling some of these players.
Is there a world, CJ, where the Leafs can capitalize on the goalie market? Because if you look at what's available, it's like there's Bob, who's a UFA, but he's 38. He's played a lot of hockey, and he makes $10 million. Jordan Binnington makes $6 million a year. And the Leafs at some point are going to have to make a decision on their goalies for next year because all three of those guys need waivers. Is that something they could think about and consider at this point?
They certainly wouldn't rule it out. I haven't heard, anything like progressing there. I mean, obviously trading a goalie is a little different circumstance. There's only so many teams looking to acquire a netminder at the deadline. But look, if the Leafs were, trading someone like Joseph Woll, you're not just bringing in teams that are trying to have success in this year's playoffs. He's still a relatively young guy. He's signed for term at a pretty good number. I do think that my sense of where the Leafs are at is that very little is off limits at this stage. The absolute top guys on the roster to me aren't in play, but most of anything beyond that, has to be considered. And, it sounds like we're probably a month now since the Leafs have really started making these guys available. And so, the word out of the Leafs front office is they're listing on a whole pile of players, and I don't think the goalies would be exempted from that.